Good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you're located, and welcome to our next webinar in our Quick Fire webinar series. I'm Chris Harvey, and today's session is on what goes into product safety investigations. If you've not attended one of these Quick Fire webinars in the past, they are meant to be very fast-moving, more conversational, so it does move very, very quick. We are going to save 5 to 7 minutes for questions at the end. The audience lines are muted, so you can enter those questions directly into the chat module. We're going to have another quick-fire webinar in late July, so stay tuned for that topic, along with the date. More information to come soon with that. So again, I'm Chris Harvey. I'm Senior Vice President of Product Innovation and Industry Engagement with Sedgwick. I am honored to be joined by a true industry expert and friend, Jason Hertzberg. Jason, did you want to say hello and introduce yourself?
I would love to say hello. Hi, everyone. Happy Tuesday? Tuesday. I'm just back from Japan, so I'm keeping track of days of the week here. Yeah, great to be here as always, and join my my friend and colleague Chris on this. I'm Corporate Vice President at Exponent, leading engineering and scientific consulting firm that is global in nature, and I head up the global consumer product safety offering for the firm, and have been working in the space pretty much exclusively for the last 25 years or so. Long time.
Yeah. Great to have you on. So when a potential product safety concern emerges, organizations are faced with the critical question: is it isolated, or can they kind of be broader? Are there broader risks that demand more formal investigations? So making the right call early can definitely reduce regulatory exposure, risk, legal risk, brand damage, but doing so definitely requires more than just intuition. So we've got some questions that I'll ask Jason today. We'll dive in. But again, if you have questions of your own, you can enter those into the chat module. So Jason, we'll go ahead and jump into the first question. So when a potential product safety issue is identified, what are the first steps that you see leading companies take as they initiate a formal investigation?
Yeah, that's a great question. Obviously, a great place to start. Let me first take a step back here and provide some context in terms of the nature of some of the very interesting and more recent consulting work that I've been asked to conduct in recent years that falls more under the softer sciences, if you will, or the company level organizational process focused efforts than the traditional failure analysis investigations that I do. So in recent years, I've been working more and more with companies in reviewing and continuously improving their product safety compliance programs. And what I mean by that are programs that involve a company's product safety related activities that are basically within their business. And these projects have been on behalf of companies that have often, just undergone a painful CPSC recall and are being required to do so. Companies that are needing to respond to another agency like, DOJ, as well as companies and board of directors just trying to mitigate their corporate risk profile in the current regulatory climate. So one of the structural changes I've worked closely with companies on is to help them create and empower a product safety committee function within the organization. And this is a committee that can be comprised of relevant, team members from, legal, engineering, QA, other players who have the ability to evaluate and direct investigations of potential product safety issues. In some cases, companies form a two-tiered committee, which includes, outside independent input into the process. And this can be from, legal as well as engineering expertise. So, for example, an outside law firm in a company like Exponent, respectively, as kind of part of the second tier of a committee. So structurally, I wanted to kind of give that context about, in terms of the question of first steps. In terms of steps themselves, I see, more and more leading companies that are looking for that empowered product safety committee to drive the investigation process, to gather all the relevant information and data. And this information will include things like, customer complaint data, images, descriptions, instant units being retrieved, from the field, making that happen. Design production data, quality assurance, quality control data, materials of construction, changes that have occurred over time, historically, to gain insight. And then assigning the tasks and responsible parties and deadlines for specific actions. I see a focus on more and more accurate documentation methods to be able to be responsive when asked for that by CPSC, for example, as well as understanding just what the company's internal criteria are for making reporting and recall decisions. That's a very important part as well, is kind of going into the process, kind of knowing what your framework is of how you're going to make those decisions as to what gets elevated and what constitutes something that you need to act on. Obviously, there are some general guidelines that are provided by CPSC in terms of when you have a duty to report and recall, but those are words on a page, and they need to be looked at very critically and obviously layered on top of what a corporate risk profile of a company is.
Yeah, and I'm sure, like me, I've experienced companies at different levels or preparedness, and you probably have come across different companies that do a better job than others being prepared to understand what they need to do with these investigations.
Exactly.
Yeah. So let's talk scope and approach a little bit. So how do you determine the scope of the investigation, and what approaches are often used in evaluating potential defects?
Yeah, again, it's a very general kind of a question, but I've said the same thing for probably 25 years now of doing these types of CPSC investigations, and that is you can't control what you don't understand. So you need to gain an understanding of the failure mechanism and the underlying root cause of what is happening in order to confidently understand the potential scope of the problem. So there may be, model differences in terms of components, design, or fabrication that make certain models susceptible to a specific failure mode, or it's possible that a wide range of models could be equally prone to a specific failure. My approach, involves reviewing, of course, all relevant documentation, including many of the items I described in the last answer. Also, a detailed failure analysis of actual returned incident units, and often testing, exemplar or unused units to understand the failure, and ideally prove that that understanding of the failure by conducting lab testing to show that I can recreate the issue, that I can turn the problem on, I can turn the problem off. So this may also involve, aside from laboratory-based testing, it can involve analytical work. So this could be, computer modeling, failure modes and effects. Finite element analysis, or what's known as FEA in the industry, looking at how stresses, are applied to different products and how things can break and fail, or calculations, or statistical, data analysis type work that can complement the empirical or lab-based work to bolster that understanding. It's always best if you can kind of look at things almost like in a dovetailed version, where you have the data and analyzing the data that's actually happening in the field, but then going ahead in the lab and actually showing in the physical world that, yeah, this all makes sense, what's happening in the field, because I can show it, I can demonstrate it, and the data is kind of supporting, as I said, the data supports the physical world and the findings in the laboratory. Always best to have that kind of multi-pronged approach to understanding a problem.
Yeah, makes sense. So about timeline, complexity, what factors influence how long an investigation may take, and how do timelines vary between very straightforward assessments and more complex, maybe potentially multidisciplinary analyses?
Right. Yeah. I mean, look, whenever I get approached about a potential engagement, I mean, the first question that the company's going to ask me is like, so how long is this going to take? How much is it going to cost? And, obviously very reasonable questions to ask, especially when a company is going through a very, challenging, stressful type of a time. I think that it's, look, it's a tricky question. As you can imagine, there's no cookie cutter answer. I think in some cases, as you said, it can be extremely challenging to complete an investigation in short order. For example, if the investigation is complex and multidisciplinary, where it's not just a a polymers question or a thermal sciences or human factors type of issue, if there are multiple types of experts that are required to really evaluate a particular scenario, or a lot of things kind of have to go wrong, and you have to kind of unpeel the onion kind of a thing, peel the onion back to figure out what's going on. If there's limited access to incident units, that can be a real challenge to really understand the nature of the failure. I mean, that's the biggest bugaboo I run into. If the available units are, let's say you get access to units, and I get all excited when that happens, when I can actually look at and examine and do non-destructive and destructive testing on units. But if those units are too far gone in terms of the actual damage they sustained, let's say from a fire or otherwise, or mechanical damage, or there's very limited relevant file material that's available, like design drawings or organized complaint data. Maybe the product safety compliance program isn't perfect and you don't have the best complaint data to work with, or from that complaint data you don't have enough traceability or understanding of what serial numbers or model numbers are at play, and you can't kind of carve it out or categorize, or you don't really have a sense of the time to failure in the field because you don't know when these products were sold or when the incident actually occurred. So you can kind of back out how much life in the field, which can offer insight into the failure mode. All these types of things can really complicate and stand in the way of getting to the answer quickly. Look, some CPSC investigations I've been able to complete literally in a matter of a few days, while others have taken on the order of many months based on the limitations that I've just outlined. So it really is hard to tell. I think that in the case where expected reporting timelines for CPSC can't be achieved, it really bears noting, and it's critical for legal, typically the general counsel or outside law firm, to communicate with the commission and relay those updates and the reasons for such a delay. If you look for guidance regarding recall investigations from CPSC, I think what you'll find is that the company's investigation to determine whether or not to report should not exceed 10 working days. I think that's kind of what you'll find there, unless the firm can demonstrate that a longer time is reasonable under certain circumstances, I think is the exact verbiage that's used. And unless there are unusual circumstances, the commission is going to assume that after 10 working days the company would have reviewed and received and considered all available information and undertaken a careful investigation. But as I said, life gets in the way and complications get in the way, and I think that the biggest thing I've seen in working with many outside lawyers from outside counsel and working with them with the commission is just that communication, just making sure that the communication is there, it's consistent, and that the commission knows that you are a company that takes it seriously and that there's due diligence and corporate responsibility involved. So that's long answer to your question, but
yeah, no, it's a good answer. I'm sure every client wants it as soon as possible, and there's always pressure to do it, but there's a right way to do it as well. Is there a particular product type that just adds more complexity? In my mind, I'm thinking lithium-ion batteries in Europe that can be difficult to get from a transportation standpoint, that being able to get your hands on, as you mentioned, the actual product to investigate it.
Yeah, that's right. Certainly transportation of batteries, for example, when you have batteries, the question is it completely spent? Is there still energy that's stored in the battery? How much energy? How much energy is too much energy? And better as well or better than I do, that becomes a real problem in terms of transport and how you can get things moving. And that's why, having a global presence, for example, like we do, is very important in terms of not having to ship batteries from Europe to the US, for example. Having a presence in London and as well as in Asia makes it a lot easier. But even so, there still are challenges. And then once you get the product back, once you get the batteries back, you have the challenge of doing you have different techniques that you can use in terms of using CT techniques to look at things non-destructively, and then actual teardowns, which take time, looking for potential reasons for the issue, whether it's a thermal runaway or other type of contamination or defect type situation or some external factor. And this just can take time. There's steps that have to be undertaken to do it in a very deliberate way to really understand what's going on mechanistically to make sure that we get to the right answer.
Yep. Yeah, good point. So once an investigation is complete, what type of deliverables can clients expect, and how do those findings typically help inform of next steps, such as moving to a recall or redesign or regulatory engagement?
Yeah, so this completely depends on the direction that is given to Exponent, for example, or any other entity. I mean, typically it's the type of deliverable, the form of deliverable, and whether there is a deliverable or not is really typically dictated by the legal department of the client, right? So in some cases, client may want a verbal report initially and maybe some draft slides to look at and review in the form of a webinar, Teams or web sharing type of a venue, but not transmitting it so they can first understand the issue and understand, where things stand. In other cases, I send along a final report in the form of a PowerPoint presentation or an external technical memorandum or maybe a more elaborate formal report. It really just depends on the circumstances and depends on the client. Sometimes this is submitted to CPSC for consideration and then further discussion, with CPSC staff members on, a conference call, for example, or in some cases, especially in high profile matters, the meetings are conducted in person at CPSC labs. I've done that many times as well, getting in front of them and having a dialogue, sometimes even with a product in front of us, where we can provide, I can discuss the work that we did and the analysis that we did and the conclusions that I came to. And then CPSC staff, do their own work, and they have their own labs and they have their own analysis that they perform. It's a really nice, working dialogue. Those in-person meetings, I actually value a lot. I think it's a great way for us, industry and myself to, collaborate and understand where CPSC is coming from and how they view things and the work that they do. And it's those are actually very, very beneficial and very enlightening. The technical findings are, certainly considered when it comes to making reporting and recall decisions, but there's also input, of course, from regulatory and legal input that goes into the decision making aside from the technical work.
Yeah, good points. And from us, from recalls, there could be no actual incident or injury that triggers a recall. There could be one. There could be more. So it just depends, right? Just depends. So Jason, what are some of the most common challenges or roadblocks encountered during product safety, and how do you overcome them?
Yeah, well, look, if you ask any of the attorneys that I routinely work with in companies, through the years, the most challenging matters are those where there are no incident units available to examine,
Yeah.
or, as I said, limited documentation to review and historical information. So therefore, there's very little insight in our ability to limit the scope of a potentially affected population in many cases in that regard. I mean, knowledge is power. If there are no documents regarding, product design and construction, I mean, we certainly can do a tear down and reverse engineer the product to help matters, but not having, instant units to understand what's actually happening in the field versus, all the things that could possibly happen make it very difficult and challenging. I think, there's a delicate balance between, what's reasonable and what reasonably could happen versus what could theoretically happen. And if you're stuck with just looking at the universe of what could theoretically happen because you don't have the actual products to go on to see what happened, then it can be very difficult and challenging to kind of rein it in. This is why the after sales complaint handling process of a product safety compliance program is an area that I spend a lot of time working on with clients, is making sure that we get to give ourselves the best chance of getting good information back, getting products back, getting enough information and data to be able to analyze and understand what needs to get elevated, what needs to be considered, and eventually, and hopefully very quickly, if there is a reporting, obligation that the company feels they need to get in front of.
Mhm. So, investigations taking place, what are some of the, follow-up, some of the risk management? So after investigation, what role does Exponent play in supporting some of this follow-up? So it could be corrective action measures, it could be some litigation support, regulatory comms, or ongoing risk mitigation.
Sure. I mean, all of the above, obviously.
Mm.
As I mentioned, after a recall, it's a very logical time for companies to dust off their product safety compliance programs, if they even have a formal one. And if not, kind of formalize one. Or, even if you don't want to formalize one, you may be forced to formalize one. And then incorporate your lessons learned and best practices to mitigate, risk going forward. Yes, I routinely support clients and outside counsel in their written submissions and discussions with CPSC to make sure that the technical aspects of the matter are clearly presented and positioned correctly, and just honestly and correctly, of course. Like Exponent staff, of course, routinely serve as expert witnesses, as you said, for matters involving litigation. Given our global reputation and experience in the area, I mean, we pretty much can meet every proactive and reactive need that a client may have. Um, with our state-of-the-art experimental tools and bench strength and all that stuff. I think that in many cases companies look to us to help them, better, looking forward, as I said, with lessons learned, helping them make better design products going forward, in terms of the design qualification and product development process. I've definitely seen us getting kind of injected into that process and playing a role going forward to try to mitigate risk. As I always tell my clients, I'm not in the, I'm not in the risk elimination business, but I'm definitely in the risk mitigation business. I mean, there's no
Right.
such thing as a zero risk product for anyone to design. It's really just a matter of what is what's acceptable, reasonable risk, and how do you get it so that you have a product that you can sell, that you can sleep at night. It's merchantable. It's has a risk profile that is completely manageable. It certainly gets more challenging when you have more complicated products, especially when you have energy sources, high energy density sources that are in your products, whether it's the e-mobility space or other more interesting products that are going to be coming online. And when you start talking about humanoids and other types of very interesting edge case, different types of scenarios and different types uh, of of products that are going to be presumably falling under the Consumer Product Safety Commission. It's going to be very interesting what the future holds in terms of
Mhm.
what society views reasonable, acceptable risk as, and where that bar goes. Does it go up? Does it go down as we move forward? Um, and looking things from a relative and absolute standpoint in terms of risk is important, and also considering just things like just general exposure. I mean, looking at failures just from a parts per million of units that you have out there is not the whole equation. You really need to look at things from a overall risk standpoint, from an exposure standpoint, human exposure. That gives another window into assessing risk.
Got it. Thanks, Jason. So I do want to open it up for audience questions. I had a couple pop in my head just around, what is AI? Is AI being used today? And everyone's talking about AI, but is AI being used today in investigations? Do you see that as a future?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, look, I mean, that's a whole nother conversation. I think
Another
that,
webinar.
yeah, right. I mean, look, AI I mean, it's incredibly powerful. Obviously, the ability to get information and arguably, knowledge for the most part, if you exclude, hallucinations and different things that can come up. I mean, I think that having a subject matter expert lens to harness and use whatever information you're getting using AI and AI tools is critical. I mean, you can't, it's a very dangerous situation if you just, use AI as the way that you're making difficult decisions with regard to risk and regard to safety. I think when you're talking about something that has no safety implications and you're really talking about just general quality or things that are just not where human health and things are on the line that for example relate to Consumer Product Safety Commission and protecting the public, you know, yeah, I guess, what's the downside of just kind of relying on that? But when you're talking about systems and products that have, safety implications, it's a whole different story in terms of the degree of confidence that you have to have in your decision making.
Yeah.
And that's where that subject matter expertise comes in, where you can use AI as a tool, but you really need that human judgment, interface, background, experience, and to be able to put things in perspective and really cross-check as well to see if the information you're getting is actually right. I mean, garbage in, garbage out. It's the same for computer, FEA models that you construct to analyze stresses on structures. It's kind of the same thing as far as just knowledge is concerned.
Got it. Makes sense. Is there any, Jason, any top hazards or risks or themes that you're seeing? When I look at the recall data, the CPSC is obviously very focused on imported products that's not meeting standards, products sold
Yep.
online marketplaces. You see violations of Reese's Law, the Sturdy Act. Are you seeing any themes yourself?
I mean, all the things you just mentioned. I mean, you have the traditional types of categories of products that are always going to be on the radar. All the battery operated things. I mean, energy, high energy density. High high level of concern. Yeah, I mean, my kind of the profile or the landscape of projects that I've been working on is still is pretty constant in terms of the types of products that come across my desk that I'm asked to look at and investigate. Um, Nothing beyond what you mentioned or kind of what's traditional. I mean, yeah, I mean, certainly having a lot of my clients who manufacture multinational global companies that are in Asia as well as Europe are certainly given the environment that we're in and CPSC's statements that they've come out with and work that they've done, it definitely makes a lot of those companies concerned and even more concerned about just making sure that they get it right and that they are not missing anything and that they are they have an understanding of how things work and how things are going to be viewed in the US from a regulatory perspective. And obviously I can't, I'm not in the brains of CPSC, but I guess they look at it as I have enough historical perspective and understanding of what makes sense to do and to try to give themselves the best uh, put themselves in the best position from the standpoint of being proactive or reactive in what they're doing. And as I said, I think the biggest thing that I'm seeing aside from just traditional failure analysis investigations is what I mentioned before, and that is just companies looking at things more from a process and organizational standpoint to make sure that they really have a structure in place that will be viewed upon favorably with the commission if, for example, something happens and they get asked about, hey, what about this? And you had this issue. Tell me about your program that you have in place to show good corporate due diligence, and that goes a long way in terms of helping that making sure that the CPSC views them as a good corporate citizen and that they're doing the right things as a company to try to keep consumers safe and running their business in that way. So
And I mean, that's promising. It sounds like more companies are trying to be more proactive and preventative. Again, like you said, no matter how robust everything is, you can't prevent everything. Unsafe products will make it to the marketplace, but it is promising to hear more proactiveness from organizations.
yeah, and I think when you have in the news, you have articles about DOJ leaning in, and you have articles about some executives that are now you have executives that are now being held responsible and seeing issues there. I mean, these are things that really were not really in play for the longest time, and these are things that get people's attention. Executives, board of directors, it really gets people's attention to make sure that they're as protective as they can be as a company.
Yep. Yep. Well, I don't see any additional questions coming in just yet. And I know we're just out of time. We will put up our contact information on a slide. If you do want to reach out to Jason or myself directly, feel free to do that with any questions that you have. This session was recorded. It will be made available to you as well. But Jason, I want to thank you for the discussion today and all the intel and insight that you shared. And I also want to thank the audience for listening in today. Thank you
Yeah,
very
me
much.
too. Ditto. Thank you so much. Always a pleasure to join you, Chris, on the virtual stage or real stage. And hope everyone has a safe day. And look forward to seeing you all at the next safety event.
Yep. Sounds good. All right. Thanks, everyone. Have a good rest of the day.
All right, take care. Bye.